All right, so hi everybody. This is Sanita Fazic, a writer and midwifing peasant futurisms based here on the unceded, unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe, also known as Ottawa. And I'm excited to talk to Alex Ketchum, who is the co-founder and organizer of the Queer Food Conference. Alex, I'm super happy to be talking to you today. The conference is happening in a week in Montreal, and I'm hoping that you know there's going to be a ton of people, farmers, chefs, food lovers, the queer community. And can you tell us a little bit about who you are and this conference?
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for having me. So, I'm Dr. Alex Ketchum. I'm an associate professor at the Institute for Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at McGill University in Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, on unceded Kanien'kehá:ka territory. And my pronouns are she, her. Yeah, so the Queer Food Conference, the first one happened in 2024. Megan J. Elias and I co-organized that one. And at that one, we had about 110 people in person, a mix of scholars, writers, journalists, chefs, seed savers, cooks, activists, artists, all coming together to talk about queer food. And now it's the second conference in 2026 here in Montreal. And it's going to be similar, a bit bigger. So about 150 to 170 people in person, plus again, it's hybrid like the last one. So there's a lot of capacity for online folks too. And we have people coming from all over the world, like even for the in-person, we have folks coming from Australia and Germany, as well as like across Canada and the US.
That's exciting. Tell me a little bit about what queer food means to you personally.
Yeah, for sure. So, like it's kind of a funny thing with Megan and I, in that like I really like to have definitions of things, and Megan likes more of the fluidity. But food can be queer through a variety of forms. I'm a labor historian, and I really see the importance of thinking about the labor of who's making the food, why is the food being made. Food is being used to by and for community in order to create community spaces for care, nourishment, a way to bring people together to also like take care of people economically as well. But there's also some food items that have been really important historically for the queer community. For example, like pot brownies that helped with wasting syndrome, which can happen with HIV/AIDS. Of course, anyone can get HIV or AIDS, but as we know, it disproportionately affected the queer community, and continues to do so. As well as like, there was like this green Dyke salad dressing that has like circulated in different pockets of like lesbian and lesbo queer communities for a long time. So there's these like historically important recipes. There's ways of like kind of things that are a bit tongue in cheek, like the rainbow cake and stuff like that. But food is really a way that we take care of each other, and queer food allows us to have a lens of looking at how queer people have been involved in the food industry, using food through potlucks for fundraising, community building, and so forth. And then Megan really likes to bring up, in the kind of queer theory type of thing of like queering food itself, of like breaking down binaries and thinking beyond certain categories of analysis. But we actually, as part of the first conference and the second one, the conference programs are cookbooks that the people attending, oh, it's a little blurred out, but on Zoom, but the people attending all can contribute if you registered by a certain date, contribute a recipe. And then the head note talks about like how that recipe reflects queer food. And you see a diversity of opinions about queer food. But I think queer food is a way for us to enter into these conversations.
That's really awesome. I have kids, and I was telling them about the queer food conference. And my 4-year-old was like, "What does that mean?" And I was like, she was eating broccoli, and I was like, "This broccoli is a bisexual broccoli," as a joke, and
Hmm.
sort of laughing about that. Obviously, I really totally take into heart both your definition and Megan's definition. I was often thinking about transcorporeality, so thinking
Hmm.
about like how our bodies are actually not just human bodies that are sort of
Hmm.
clothes, but we are the bodies of food, the bodies of water that we consume, and it's always fluid and moving
Yeah.
through us. So there's definitely something to be said about queering food, but also queering the body and the queer body.
Definitely. And
So
like we are a compilation of so many microorganisms. And the other thing too is like, there's like some of the presenters at the last conference gave a presentation on non-binary botany because, right, like the plant organisms that like we eat, as well as like the fungus, like some types of mushrooms have like thousands of genders, And so like biology is not a binary, and so that is also our relationship to the foods that we're eating and consuming.
Yeah. Well, what kinds of conversations or tensions do you hope this year's conference will surface, especially across disciplines like food writing, activism, culinary arts, and farming, etc.?
Yeah, I think like one of the things that I found really amazing with the conference is that for some people, they're really used to kind of a format of a conference and they get surprised because we mix things up a little bit. Like we don't have keynotes in the like standard way. So we all eat together. So five of the meals are eaten together. And the like keynotes are the people who made the food. So they talk about like their process and how the food reflects their ideas of queer food. And we all like sit and eat the food. So in the morning, we'll be like eating these cinnamon rolls from Royal Jeanette, which is a queer women-owned bakery here in Montreal. And we'll be eating those cinnamon rolls and hearing about like what queer food means to them. And we'll be sipping coffee from Dispatch, which is owned by a queer woman of color, and hearing about like her experiences with the coffee industry and stuff like that, and how that reflects queer food. And so yeah, so that's one thing. Just for people to have a more like embodied relationships with the conversations we're happening is something I look forward to. I really am a big fan of interdisciplinarity, and I'm also a big fan of breaking down these barriers that I think a lot of people have between academia and non-academic kinds of conversations. For me, like I really believe in, I'm going to use like the fancy term ontologies, like ways of knowing or how we know, but like there's so many different ways that we can know about food. And so the way that this conference is designed is to honor all those different ways, whether it's like tactile or through creation or through growing or through observation or artistically or all of them combined. So I really love seeing people coming from these different perspectives coming together and chatting. And I think, like, yes, sometimes there might be tensions in terms of like how people are framing things, but in general, if this year's conference is anything like the last one, it actually is just like really productive and is bringing people together and fosters a lot of future collaborations. So after the first food conference, Megan and I edited a book that came out this fall, October 2025, with Arsenal Pulp Press called Queers at the Table. I know it's boring again. But this book brings together 10-page comics, 10 recipes that were illustrated by the cartoonists, and 10 essays. And it's a mix of contributors of folks who presented papers at the conference. The cartoonists, we did a partnership with Prism Comics, which is an LGBTQ like nonprofit to support queer cartoonists. And then like also recipes were done in partnership also with the Queer Food Foundation as well as folks involved with the conference. And like so this book was just like another type of like output of the conference of like fostering other ways of helping people network across different fields, having spaces for mentorship and providing more opportunities. And I think one of my favorite things with the last conference was, again, it's not just for academics, but there were a bunch of graduate students who came up to me and said, like, hey, my committee didn't believe in the project I wanted to do, but then I was able to show them I was submitting to this conference. And now that there's these publications, and now my committee actually supports my project. And for me, that's actually been one of the most rewarding things because with the conference, we've been kind of able to solidify the subfield of queer food studies. And when I was a grad student, I got so much pushback, and people were like, oh, this isn't serious research. And so it's amazing to be able to open up opportunities and spaces to make things a bit easier for like the next generation of scholars.
Yeah, well, that's probably why I'm so interested in Queer Food Conference. I did my PhD at Queen's and
Okay.
cultural studies. So cultural studies at Queen's is it's just it's a graduate program. You can do an MA or a PhD. I did a PhD and I specialized in the intersection between like peasant food growing practices and the history of capitalism, and sort of trying to look at how peasant knowledges have been disrupted by industrial agriculture, and not just peasant knowledges in terms of growing food, but also in terms of mutual aid, etc. And trying to sort of contend with, for example, the places where my own peasant heritage from Bosnia would not work with with who I am today as a non-binary, lesbo-queer, kind of writer scholar. They were pretty heteronormative spaces, but still, I think there's something to be said about those traditions and existing like in tandem with, feminism, post-humanism, and queer theory. And I taught gender studies at Queen's, so I'm actually really excited to pick up your book. I'm guessing we'll be able to buy it at the conference when we get there. Fantastic.
Yeah, Le Goulion, the queer feminist bookshop, will be the bookseller on site. They're based in Montreal, so yeah.
Perfect. So that's really wonderful, and I love that it's open to artists and activists and chefs and farmers and bringing everybody together around the table, not like literally, but also as a metaphor to break bread and like have
Hmm.
conversations and eat. And that's another thing I wanted to ask you about is I noticed the ticket to get in was $50. There's quite a few meals, and so I think
Yeah,
that's
there's
really inclusive.
five meals
Yeah.
and a cookbook. So like for folks who aren't aware, like most conferences are really expensive.
Yes.
Like we have like one partner event that like that ticket's like $35 for a meal, you know? So the way it was able to be this cheap, like 50, technically 53 Canadian dollars, because like on the ticket thing, and there's always that like extra fee. So it's even cheaper than the last one. So for like the Americans, it's like 40 something bucks. And I got so the we got a grant from the Canadian Tri-Council, Shirk, for a connection grant. So over the past year, I've organized over 22 events, almost all of them completely free, all about different parts of queer food, related to different themes from the book, and all done with community partners. So, for example, on December 1st for World AIDS Day, we partnered with AIDS Community Care Montreal, and we had contributors whose stuff in the book touched on like HIV, AIDS, and food, and they all spoke, and it was like a free event, like a online event. And we've done one with queer and trans farmers, one with like how queer cartoonists think about writing about food. We've like all of these have been in partnership with like different farms or with like Right to Food Canada, or like every single event has been about uplifting different groups and bringing together different communities. So that partner, or sorry, that connection grant enabled me to like pay everyone who was participating, pay research assistants to like help me run the tech and do that, and then also subsidize the conference. And then we also got some funding from RCAF, which is like the feminist like collective. It's like under FRQSC, which is kind of like the Quebec Tri-Council here in Quebec. And yeah, so that was able to like offset a lot of the costs. And then the other thing that keeps the price quite low is that I have volunteered over 500 hours of labor. So there's also a lot of like sweat equity behind it. So, and like, there have been, like, for example, for the online one, there's like some folks from like Brazil who wrote in and were like, and so it was like, okay, sure. But like, I still do have to pay people, like all the people who are providing food, we want to make sure that they are properly compensated. And then they're also paid honorariums of like $800 to give talks about the food in addition to cooking. So, and all of the students working for the conference are being paid as well, with like benefits and stuff, like about $32 an hour. So I'm really like labor is really, really key in kind of the formation of it, but I had to charge like something to still offset some of the costs.
No, I'm incredibly impressed and grateful for all the labor, visible and invisible, that you and Megan have put into making this possible. And instantly, when I saw that ticket, I figured, oh, there's been so much work behind the scenes to probably get funding to make this a possibility for all of us. So I'm really grateful and I'm really excited. I'm going to ask you a few questions a little bit. Again, we're going to get a little bit more nerdy here because
Yeah, for
that's what
sure.
I'm into. So, and
I
I'll
love it.
excellent. And I'll talk from the framework that obviously I'm most passionate about, which is peasant traditions. So, thinking about peasant futurisms and centering land based knowledges, subsistence practices, and anti extractive futures. How do you see queer food cultures reshaping or reclaiming relationships to land, farming, food sovereignty within this framework?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there can be like a tension here. So I'm going to point to Taylor Hartson, who contributed to the book and also to the last conference, as well as Tristan, who also co-wrote with Taylor. And so we kind of see this like tension around kind of like queerness and trying to create community, like especially historically, without necessarily an understanding of the fact that we're on like colonial lands, the histories and legacies of colonialism. So I'm thinking of like 1970s lesbian back to the land movements, right? This idea of like we'll create our own community, but not necessarily being attentive to like the lands that people were on and deciding to create these intentional communities on. Whereas I do see a move now within kind of a lot of queer and trans farming discussions of this like of understanding like unceded territory, of understanding rather than it being about this kind of like remaking of this like industrial agriculture or even like in a kind of conventional organic agricultural sense, but instead thinking about stewarding the land and relationality. There's been like really, I would say, important work, especially coming out of the fermentation space, also around of thinking about our relationships to the more than human and the non-human creatures. So thinking about Sandra Katz's work as well as many other writers of thinking about just our relationship to land and space as one of like actual relationships and not about conquering. And so I think that has kind of shifted the conversations and just like a greater sense of like awareness of like the social justice issues of like who has access to land, what communities can. And that's also not about always being separatist as well, right? That's been like a shift since the 70s of like how can you be in community with others, even those who you don't agree with in these kinds of conversations, especially around like urban agriculture and stuff like that. So I think those are some of the tensions that we've seen and the kind of different types of conversations that are happening. And there's definitely been, I know, like for my own understanding, so I was really involved in running my school's organic farm when I was an undergrad, Long Lane Farm in Middletown, Connecticut. And some folks on the farm, I ran the food politics house living community with 15 folks, and some folks involved with the farm ran this agroecology course. And that's when I know I started learning a lot more about peasant agriculture and the Zapatistas and like other movements around the world and starting to make some of those connections. So I think we're seeing a rise of more and more awareness around it, but unlearning and relearning around histories and legacies and ongoing colonialism continues to be a challenge. And then, of course, the way that like capitalism ends up shaping a lot of people's relationship to the land and their food continues to be an ongoing, ever-present challenge.
Yeah, because you can't really, I mean, you could be peripheral to capitalism, but there's no one can really be indigenous to land because it's state owned. Ultimately, you always have to pay taxes, etc. And myself, coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I was born, and growing up on my grandparents' peasant homesteads in the summers, um, there was never a time where it was entirely non-extractivist or non-capitalist. This seems to me
Hmm.
that would be. I mean, I'm not a specialist of that. I know more about European peasant traditions where I come from, but um, I do have a yearning to be able to be at least maybe just 50% food sovereign, whether that's trading with other farmers or urban farmers or micro farmers,
Mm.
doing my own tiny permaculture garden, tiny orchard. These things are really important to me, but I don't actually have access to land. I rent land from a landlord. And so there's all these
Hmm.
problems as well. And all of the land that's in Ottawa is unceded and unsurrendered, which is really a
Hmm.
mechanism for stolen. So there's a lot of ethical dilemmas and complexity, and even just having this conversation on unsurrendered and unceded land. Well,
Yeah, definitely.
yeah, so I'll move on to my next question. Many queer food traditions emerge from improvisation, scarcity, and community care. How do these practices resonate with peasant futurist ideas of resilience, mutual aid, and non capitalist food systems?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like, I actually would say like the three things you mentioned as the latter as part of peasant food futurisms are also part of the same thing for queer food. Like, there's so much about like care and resilience being interlinked, right? Like that is what makes our communities resilient is because we can care for each other. Same thing, right, with mutual aid. So I'll give like some more concrete examples to kind of speak of how queer food kind of represents all of these things simultaneously and also allows us to think of the kind of futures that we want to build and how we can see that kind of relationship. So, for example, like one thing that folks may have seen is like there's a lot of times like fundraisers for someone's gender affirming surgery, right? There will be like big sales and oh, we're going to have basically like essentially a rent party where there will be food or people will like bake food and they'll auction it off or sell it off in order to like raise money for their friend. And then the other component of this too is that like sometimes when folks are recovering from gender affirming surgeries, that their friends will take turns of making meals for them as well. And so one of the presenters at the Queer Food Conference, Isabel, who will be presenting again and was involved in the book for the work on Get Fat, Don't Die, which was a part of a zine called DPN, which had a whole column about basically how you could make foods that would help, like foods that were yummy and very filled with calories when it was really hard to eat when you're dealing with different HIV/AIDS stuff. And so Isabel was inspired to embark on this project and actually cook all of these recipes while cooking for their friend who was recovering from top surgery. So we see these like the way that histories and futurities go, because I would say that like any effort to build community is an investment in the future. It's believing that we can come together and make something more and continue to live and build the kind of lives that we want to build on an individual and collective scale. So I think that's in some ways. Also, a few years ago, I curated an exhibition about queer cookbooks and like what do queer cookbooks mean? And a lot of historical queer cookbooks, especially, were community cookbooks, kind of similar to like our conference ones where people are submitting different recipes. But in those cases, they were oftentimes used as fundraisers. It would be like support the Pride March, support the Queer Archive, support, like all these different things. I mean, it would more be like the Gay and Lesbian Archive at that time, but before queer gets reclaimed in the same degree. But yeah, so there's these ways of like using food to bring us together, to build that resilience, to build that resistance, to build that care and mutual aid. So I don't think that these are like strange concepts to queer community, but I do think that's what delineates queer food from gay food, for example. Whereas gay food does not necessarily have that same kind of investment in community. Like queerness isn't just an identity, it's not just a sexual orientation, it's also a political commitment to care. So,
I really
yeah,
appreciate you grinding it in a very concrete, very beautiful example. I have two more questions for you.
perfect.
Peasant futurism challenges dominant narratives of progress and modernity. In your view, how can queer food practices disrupt mainstream food industry norms, whether in restaurants, publishing, agriculture, on the farm?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. So we talked a little bit already about kind of queer food and like Taylor's work in particular, but we had this great event that a couple weeks ago about queer and trans farming. And there are a bunch of different queer and trans farmers involved. Jenna Jacobs, who runs Le Film Champ qui Chante, here like in Greater Montreal, like an hour from Montreal-ish. But like is a community supported agriculture and it's a trans and queer run farm. Taylor's work, as well as Kay Green and Chris Keefe, who are seed savers involved with the Hudson Valley Seed Project and more, and also run non-binary botany. And so all of them were really involved in thinking about, like, again, like what is our relationship to plants? What is our relationship to animals? Like, how can we think about the land? The knowledge of the land, who's in relationship to the land and our greater communities. So in that way, like queer food is disrupting a lot of different ideas of like agriculture. It's thinking beyond just extraction. It's thinking about investing in like futures beyond our own lives. Like some principles, I guess you could say also like seven generation of thinking of seven generations past, or sometimes seven generations as generations before and future. But I would also say in terms of, so that's on the farming side. For the restaurant side, so this is like a topic that's very close to my heart, because I spent basically from 2010 until 2022 plus, working on a project about the history of feminist restaurants, which were run primarily by lesbians and queer women. My book, Ingredients for Revolution, talks about this history of over 230 restaurants from 1972 to 1989, and then I brought it to 2022. But like a lot of their work was about disrupting kind of kitchen hierarchies. So for folks who are like aware of like the French Brigade system, it's very hierarchical. But even if you're not like fine dining French Brigade, you still have a lot of hierarchies and power inequities within kitchens and also relationships to service staff. And so the feminist restaurants, again, run primarily by lesbians and some women who now identify as queer, um, they were like really trying to disrupt these kinds of hierarchies. They would do rotating, like people would rotate through different roles. Many of them didn't have like waitresses because they didn't like that like power dynamic. They had open kitchen concepts, which it wasn't called that at the time, but they wanted people to see the labor or have windows onto the kitchen. They a lot of them had this investment in I have this diagram in the book Ingredients for Revolution of like what they're trying to do. It's really hard to balance, but this triangle of making sure that like the farm laborers and the people producing the raw materials were paid properly and treated well. The people working in the space were getting what they didn't use the language of living wage, but basically they're talking about living wage. And they also wanted to make sure that the people coming to the space could actually afford it. And so when you're thinking about like, especially like lesbians in the 70s, that is not like a very rich group of individuals because, you know, they're facing sexism and heterosexism. Many of them also had children, and then also they're facing racism or ableism and all these other things. So what they would do is like it's really hard to like balance that, right? Have like food for cheap, pay people well, etc. So they would have like sliding scale items and stuff like that, or like let someone like order a cup of tea and sit there for 6 hours, you know, like so that they could be in the space. What some of the kind of like queer feminist spaces have done today, like Augusta Yearwood, who has businesses in New Paltz, New York, and New York City. So Augusta has like a mitzvah wall, which in like Jewish culture, a mitzvah is like a something you do nice for others. And so it's basically like kind of a pay it forward wall where people can be like $5 towards someone who's like having a rough day, you know, like all these things, like a free cup of coffee for like a Black trans woman who like you know, works in a community organization. There will be all these different mitzvahs, so people can also then participate in this space and take one of the mitzvahs. So there's like different ways of opening up the space, and so queer restaurants and feminist restaurants are often trying to disrupt that. I gave a talk the other night at the McCord Museum, and someone was asking, like, well, can you have queer food that's gourmet? And that itself, right? Like, gourmet kind of creates this like elite space, and it can be quite challenging. I think there are some restaurants that are trying to do it. Because they also have those ways of opening up to community. So, Hags in New York gets a lot of kind of media attention. It's queer trans owned. And you know, it's like fine dining. It's a small space, but they have a community brunch that's pay what you can. And I actually went last time I was in New York, and it really was like they just give you a card and they're like, write whatever amount you want down on this. And they let you know like kind of like what it would be for like fair pricing for them. But you could literally write $3 and leave and have this like amazing meal. So um yeah, so that's again like their way of trying to like open up the space to broader community. Yet, you know, during the week they make their money on the fine dining. So again, that's what I would say is like kind of queer food. So you asked about farms, restaurants, oh, and publishing. Okay, yeah, for sure. So with this book, like I think the Queers at the Table book, like it can be taught in classes, but like we really want to just bring these conversations to broader publics by having the mix of recipes and comics with very short essays. It makes it a lot more accessible, these kinds of conversations. They're pretty jargon free, but have like still deep engagement with the topics. And like comics make it a more embodied experience, but people can also like embody through actually making the recipes. Um, and then like with like the conference too, like I have a big commitment to every academic thing I do. Like the Ingredients for Revolution is also available open access. Like if it's an academic text, there's an open access version. If it's not an open access text, there's a zine or a podcast or something because you know, my research is funded by Canadian tax dollars. You know, I feel like people should have access to what I'm doing. But even if that wasn't the case, even if I wasn't in that kind of economic ecosystem, I just like I don't want to like gatekeep this knowledge. Like a lot of people don't have access to queer history, so I feel like it's my responsibility to share it. So in addition to the cookbooks, which there's PDFs also online for free, there's also like related to the Queer Food Conference. Some of my students and I just co-curated an exhibition called um, oh, what is the actual name of the exhibition? But it's about, I'll just think of it, a taste of queer Montreal. And so it's about, but it's in four languages. So the whole exhibition's in English, French, Gaha, and Inuktitut. So Gaha, also sometimes known as Mohawk, and Inuktitut are the two most commonly spoken Indigenous languages, and then English and French, like for in Montreal. And so this exhibition is like bringing out these queer food histories here in Montreal and connected to different communities, but it's also this whole exhibition's digitized, available at cafequeermontreal.com. And then there's also, as part of it, there's walking tours we made that are available as zines in English and French. They're printable PDFs. They're also distributed throughout the city. But the walking tour is also available in like all major podcast apps, as well as just downloadable audio files and downloadable text files, so you can change the font. So yeah, so just like I would say that the kind of disruption, and then also I made a zine about just like how we got the grants to make these projects possible so others can do it. So I think for me, like queer food can disrupt publishing if you are a nerd who has a commitment to disrupting publishing more generally. And it's been amazing to work with like a mix, like in this conversation, I've talked about academic publishers for open access stuff, a trade publisher who was like totally on board to keep the book quite cheap. Like for a full color book, it's like under $30, which is pretty wild. And then having like all these different free publications, physical and virtual. So I guess those are ways. I know that's a really long answer, but yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I'm glad you took your time. I think we'll skip the last question and I'll just sort of end it by saying thank you so much. I can't wait to come to the conference. What's one or two events that you're really, really excited about?
Oh, okay.
It's a
So
lot
like
to
it's
ask.
kind of hard because yeah, well, it's okay. I'm not going to like say a specific panel, although I am pretty excited for Blue Delaquante's like panel around queer comics because Blue did our cover and was a contributor to the book, but we've actually never met in person. So I'm really excited to meet Blue in person. Blue also has this amazing comic called Meal, done in partnership with Soleil Ho, who like is involved in a lot of like the food scene in San Francisco. So I'm excited for Blues. And when I scheduled it, I put the workshop at the end of one of the days because as conference organizer, I can't actually go to a lot of the like actual panels because I'm like running around doing things. But I'm like, okay, if it's the last session of the day, maybe I can actually see it. And then I'm really excited actually for our like keynotes and meals. I already mentioned some of the food, but I'm also really excited for Marina Mia, which is like a queer women-owned Mexican restaurant here in Montreal. And like, oh, I'm so excited for the food and their talk. And then we're going to have a dance party at Club Didi's, which is a trans and queer owned like dance club, like just like a cool space here in Montreal on Saint Laurent. And my friend Mint is like the owners. And I was like, hey, can we use the space? And they're like, yeah, you can use it for free. So they're opening on a night that they're not normally open, and that'll be like the closing party will be really fun.
Is
But
that
I'm honestly just excited.
night?
What?
Is that Sunday night? That
Yeah, that's Sunday night.
okay.
Yeah, so that should be really fun. But it's amazing because we have like, I'm just also excited for the other things going on in the city. Like, there's going to be some vernissages of some like graduate student art exhibitions happening at the same time related to queer food. There's one about salt. There's just like all these really fun things for folks who are interested. Like, if you go to queerfoodconference.com under the schedule, you can like scroll to the bottom and see like all these other fun things. But the conference is going to be great. I'm really excited for people to just like be in the space, gathering together, eating, sharing food, and collaborating. And I'm excited to see like other publications that come out of this and future collaborations. Like it has been so cool to see like all of the people who have built stuff since the last conference. So
For
that
sure.
is probably the most fulfilling.